let's think about the total expenditure test. The total expenditure test tells us about the relationship between the price elasticity of demand for a product and the total expenditure on that product by consumers. This is a very handy concept, especially in business, but also for governments. But let's think of it from the perspective of business. Let's imagine that you're running a business that has control over the price of the product that it sells. So you get to choose what price you'll charge to your customers. And you're contemplating whether to increase the price of the product or not. Let's say you increase the price by 1%. You can see how this is going to be related to price elasticity of demand. You increase the price by 1%. What will happen to total expenditure by consumers for your product? Well, in order to think about that, let's write down the equation for total expenditure. Now that equation is simply going to be total expenditure equals the price of the product times the quantity purchased. Pretty straightforward. So we increase the price of the product by 1%. What's going to happen to total revenue? Well, when we increase the price, we know, according to the law of demand, the quantity demanded will fall. Okay, so what's happening to total expenditure? On the one hand, total expenditure is being dragged up by a higher price. On the other hand, it's being dragged down by a lower quantity demanded. So what's happening to total expenditure overall? Will it increase or will it decrease? Well, surprise, surprise, that will depend on how responsive the quantity demanded is to that change in price. In other words, it will depend on the price elasticity of demand. Whether demand is elastic, highly responsive to a change in price, or inelastic, relatively unresponsive to that change in price. So, let's say we increase our price by 1%, and we discover that the quantity demanded by consumers falls by 1%. So we know that total expenditure, E, is being dragged up by 1% and simultaneously being dragged down by 1%. What do you think will happen to total expenditure overall? It should be pretty obvious, and you can do a quick calculation with some numbers to check, and you'll find out what's going to happen to elasticity, but you should be able to figure it out already. By the way, is demand elastic or inelastic in this case? When the effect equals the cause. Well, we know in that case when we put the effect over the cause, we're going to get a coefficient, in this case, of 1. 1 over 1 equals 1. Or unit. This is unit price elastic. What's going to happen to expenditure when we've got unit price elastic demand? Nothing. It will remain constant. Even though price has gone up, expenditure will not change because the quantity demanded decreased by proportionally. Let's take a different example. We increase price by 1%, and let's say the quantity demanded falls by 5%. Is demand elastic or inelastic in this case? We know demand is price elastic. It's responsive to a change in price because the effect, the change in the quantity demanded, is greater than the cause, the change in the price. So we know that demand is price elastic in this case. And because it's price elastic, what's going to happen to total expenditure? It's being dragged up by 1% On the other hand, it's being countervailed and dragged down by 5% simultaneously. What's going to happen overall? Well, overall, it's going to fall by approximately 4%. So if the demand for your product is price elastic and you increase the price, then the expenditure by consumers on your product will fall. What if you increase the price by 1% and the quantity demanded falls by only 0.5%? Is this price elastic or price inelastic? In this case, we can clearly see that the effect, the 0.5%, is smaller than the cause, 1%. So we would say that demand is relatively price inelastic in this case. So what's going to happen to expenditure because demand is relatively price inelastic? It's being dragged up by 1% and it's being dragged down by 0.5%. Overall, we can say that expenditure will rise approximately by 0.5%. Okay. So when demand is relatively price inelastic, if a business or firm were to increase the price, total expenditure on the product will actually rise. It won't fall, total expenditure will rise. Because very few consumers will decrease the quantity demanded for the product and they will continue to buy the product and they'll pay a higher price for it.